Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here on a Sunday afternoon. So today we're going to get together to have a conversation about supporting children on the spectrum from sort of an agency perspective. And that's why you are all here as experts. And I know we have Manit here, and you are a registered nurse and also co-founder of SAAAC. We have Munira here, who is, and I'm going to read this one. Munira, you are representing Thorncliffe Collaborative for Muslim Families, and you are also a mother of a child on the spectrum. Niran, you are the current Director of Social Enterprise and Adult Services at the SAAAC Autism Center, as well as many other accomplishments. And Clovis and Sharon, you're both parents of a child on the spectrum, as well as passionate advocates and co-founders of an organization, Salbona. Yes. So I'm going to allow just across the panel to speak more about yourself, what you do professionally, why autism, how did autism enter your world, and why you are so passionate about it. So Manit, we'll start with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Usha. So as you mentioned, my name is Manit. I'm a co-founder for SAAAC Mental Health, which is a South Asian mental health initiative. And it started because Jasmine, my best friend, she's the other co-founder. We're both registered nurses. We were working in the field of mental health for maybe about 5 years. So working in the hospital and working in the community, I soon realized that a lot of individuals with an ethnic background, specifically South Asian, even though they're in the mental health system, had no understanding of mental health, and that completely boggled my mind. Working on an acute, chronic community mental health team, seeing patients that were in the system 15, 20 years, had no idea about their diagnosis, their families had no idea. And that really struck me. I'm like, how's this possible? You're having appointments, you're working with interdisciplinary teams, and that's where the idea of SAAAC really came about in terms of doing cultural linguistic mental health promotion. So we've been doing community workshops, anti-stigma campaigns. We're very prominent on ethno-cultural media outlets on doing awareness on mental health. And then specifically with autism, so it's a neat story because I was actually talking about, this video and this series that's coming out with a family member yesterday, and they're like, how did this project come to you? And we had a community member who attended one of our community workshops back in the day, who then started working with Autism Ontario as a system navigator. And through that, realized that parents of children, with autism were really struggling with mental health. And so she approached her manager to get SAAAC involved to provide cultural linguistic workshop series for caregivers and how to support their mental health. And that's how we are now in this space, pretty much started that series this year.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as you mentioned, my name's Munira. First and foremost, I'm a parent with a child on the spectrum, my son, who is now taller than me. He's 14 and in grade 9. I always say my children have been my best teachers, which has brought me to where we are today. Basically having to navigate through what education looked like for my son, what healthcare looked like for my son, what navigating the systems look like for us as a family. That kind of culminated in my understanding that I had tools and I had ways that I could support families and parents around me. So myself and just as you said, one of my very close friends, Safira, who's the other co-lead for the Thorncliffe Collaborative for Muslim Families, both of us together, we partnered with the Children's Aid Society with their community development program to help us engage better with the community of Thorncliffe Park, recognizing that there were huge gaps in how families were accessing services, and the fact that there were so many barriers to very simple things like them understanding what the diagnosis was about, what that actually meant for them. So this was around, 8-9 years ago that we started that, and it essentially meant we partnered with organizations that lead agencies for autism and brought them into the community, which made it that much easier for parents to access those services, to ensure that they had, for example, language supports. We had translators there. We had like very, very simple things, having child-minding present so that they could bring in their babies in strollers and have somebody to play with them, right? So just creating a welcoming space. And the spaces that the parents would come to were spaces they were already familiar with, like the school staff room, just the room right across from the office. So familiar spaces, just to break down all of those barriers so that they could access and understand what's going on in a way that's most comfortable and most relevant to them. That journey kind of led me on to my current role, is that I coordinate a school-based pediatric clinic for Health Access Thorncliffe Park. And my role there is essentially kind of the next step, which is helping to navigate families, first of all, through the actual diagnostic pathway, and then post-diagnosis through service navigation as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Usha, for introducing me, and I guess I'm very impressed with the fellow panelists. Quite impressive. So my name is Niran. I am the current director of social enterprise and adult services at SAAAC. The reason why I kind of started my journey with individuals with exceptionalities was I was 16 years old. As a 16-year-old from an immigrant family, things can go very wrong very quickly. And I remember walking through a community center and I saw this posting for being a Special Olympics coach. At 16, I knew I needed some direction and I signed up. And I'm going to be very honest, I was very afraid because I didn't know what to expect. And I had a bias. I had a preconception of what that experience might be. And I remember going into that gym floor or that gym and witnessing something that was forever life-changing. My biases, my perceptions were altered, just shifted completely. Every person that came through that door was very abled, very passionate about playing hockey. And I didn't think it was going to go that far, but that day changed my whole life. I knew that this was something that I wanted to do to influence our communities, to be a part of our communities, to stand up for people who typically don't have that voice. Growing up in South Africa, being marginalized based on the color of my skin was also a huge experience for me and a reason why I'm an advocate today. I think being judged by the color of my skin, being told what to do, what to say, without even knowing me, back when I was in South Africa, is still very apparent today. I think when I'm director of social enterprise at SAAAC, we are trying to make our practices and policies or procedures neurodiverse. We're trying to make it equitable. We're trying to make it inclusive. And we all know finding work for just ourselves is very challenging. It's even more challenging for someone with autism, someone who might be Black, someone who might be brown, someone who might be whatever color of the rainbow. When people are marginalized, I think our society runs on this machine where it's okay to have these biases and it's okay to look at these groups very one-dimensionally. And I think it's impossible. It's literally impossible to view people that way because our brains are so complex, our experiences are so complex, our training, our education. So that's why I just don't think there should be an oversimplification of who people are. So that's why at SAAAC we've been trying really hard to support individuals who come from very different backgrounds, but on top of that are autistic. We focus on intersectionality, which means that we don't look at just the diagnosis, we look at the cultural component. We know that our culture has a huge paradigm influence, the way that we view the world, and definitely how we view mental health. So if we can collaborate with other cultures, talk about mental health, talk about how we can strategize and overcome these barriers, together, without judgment, I think we're gonna push humanity in the right direction. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, hello, I'm Sharon, and here with my husband of 30 years, Clovis, and we represent Salbona Afrocentric Circle of Support. And how we came to be on this journey, we have a 25-year-old son who is on the autism spectrum. He was diagnosed at the age of 4, so we've been officially on this journey for the last 21 years. But as a result of experiences as a parent in raising him and navigating the services that exist out there for persons, for children and adults on the spectrum, financial resources, human resources. And then additionally, I'm also a school principal with the Toronto District School Board at the elementary level. And so I've had experiences there as both a teacher and as administrator, again, seeing the struggles of racialized parents to really understand what services, what supports are available, to witness their struggles, to witness their lack of knowledge of the help that they can get. And as a result, they further struggle, they further feel isolated, and their children don't advance the way I think they could if they had access, if they knew, if they had those partnerships, if they had that understanding. And so this is why we started this group a year ago. So we started in November of 2020, and so we've just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. And at this point, when we started off, we had about 40 families that came out to our first virtual online group. Now we're at over 160 who are a part of our email community, as well as the Facebook group, and over 100 on our Facebook group. And again, the families and participants are not necessarily the same on the two mediums. But that goes to show and affirm that the work that Clovis and I have undertaken is filling the gap, is filling a void. The whole point of our group is to empower parents. The whole point of our group is to educate them, to help them to know, not to say that they are lesser intelligent, but it's those nuances of this journey that we're on in caring for a loved one who's on the autism spectrum. And then we also want to enlighten community. And that's why we're happy to be here today and be a part of this, a very amazing panel to help educate the Diagnostic Hub communities and how they can do a better job of working with racialized families to get them started the right way on this very long, emotional journey that can be much more positive, with much more celebrations along the road than what too many of us have experienced, ourselves included. So that's just a little bit about what has brought me here today.
And really, the only thing that I would add is that bringing people together, bringing these Black families together, one of the things that we've seen is what for many of them felt like individual experiences. Collectively, as they started sharing, we started to realize that within the professional clinical environment, there are inherent biases, inherent structures that make the experience of these families feel unwelcome. Parents feel judged. Parents don't feel like they can be themselves. And as such, two things happen. Either they come reluctantly or don't come at all. And far too often we see that they don't actually come, which is why so many have responded to our group, because they feel like they'll actually have a voice. So really the recommendation would be for these mainstream systems to understand that cultural relevance, cultural competence is not just an addition or an add-on to the work, but it has to be infused in what they do, because they're really marginalizing a good segment of our population.
I'm really humbled to be here with all of you. I mean, the expertise and the knowledge is incredible. So when we started this project and we did a little bit of a landscape review to see, what was out there in the literature, there were 2 American scholarly articles about Black families navigating autism. And then there was nothing about South Asian families. Like, the data didn't even exist. There was one study that was published, and it used South Asia as a diaspora. And we know it's a huge diaspora. There's so many communities, but it was just like the South Asian families, this is what they're going to do. Are you surprised that there's such a lack of scholarly work out there? And what do you think contributes to that?
So great question. I think this takes me back to doing my master's. So I did a thesis looking at the experience of South Asian, specifically Punjabi subgroup, on their experience of navigating services for depression. And there is barely any research on, I can speak for South Asians because I think, doing my research on that community. And I'm not surprised because and in our experience of starting SAAAC, and even now looking and hearing about the work that's being done within the autism community, our resources have not been invested onto ethnic minorities, right? And I think it kind of goes twofold. I think mainstream services are very westernized. Like the focus is very Western. It's the Western model. And so, like it was mentioned, cultural competency is like an add-on. It's like a bonus. Like, hey, this is our foundational work we're doing, but we will be culturally sensitive or competent, and we'll add these in. We'll throw in a policy, but that actual work is not being done. And I think the challenge is we're not engaging those communities. So I've worked at when I worked in the hospital and when I worked at a community mental health agency, I never saw ethnic communities being part of the conversation for delivery of services. What are their struggles? And also not having an outsider doing that research. I think, when I looked at South Asian mental health research that was out there, it was outsiders who were doing interviews in English on our community. And as a nurse, I've seen patients have a less than 5-minute appointment with a psychiatrist because it was in English. But if I happened to attend, it would be very lengthy. I think the other thing is the buy-in from the community. Our community, I know specifically South Asians, have a lot of doubt and engagement in research. Like that was my experience when trying to do research. They felt they didn't understand confidentiality because that concept doesn't really exist back home. You feel afraid if you share your personal story. Even with healthcare professionals that are of the same background, they're gonna share, they're gonna tell people. And then some people were really worried, like, if I did participate in research, it's gonna somehow impact my PR status, my citizenship. The government's gonna be out to get me. So I don't think we've made an effort to really educate racialized communities to understand the value of research and where it comes from. I think that is changing. Like I do see efforts. I mean, we're here today because it's changing, right? But I think that's my understanding and my own experience of the lack of research on ethnic communities.
I'd like to add, no, I'm not surprised at all that would be the result of your research. I think, again, to piggyback on the ideas just shared, that unfortunately, I believe in much of what we do in Western society defaults to whiteness. I'm in education, and that is something that we are trying to challenge in education, that we've got to stop with the curriculum starting from for instance, when we're talking about Black history and Black heritage, that we don't start at slavery, because Black society existed way before slavery. That when we're talking about Indigenous persons, that we don't just start at when the British and the French landed here on North American soil, what is now called North American soil, and so on. So that's an education. And that's in the medical field as well, that we default to white bodies and white ways of being and white ways of seeing things. When we talk about autism, for example, I never forget back when my son was first diagnosed, so this had been around year 2000, 2001 or so, watching a video about autism and diagnosis in the journey, and a Black mother on the screen sharing how she had to fight the medical system because they refused to give her a diagnosis of autism for her son because Black children don't have autism. And perhaps it's the same in the South Asian culture as well. But she was in shock because she knew that's exactly what her son was living with But they're like, no, it only affects white people, Euro people. And I connected with that so much to understand that was her experience. And that really set me up for the uphill battle that I was going to face. And again, hence the group that we've created for them to learn how to challenge these stereotypes and challenge this practice of pathologizing our racialized children, that when they behave a certain way and when they can't meet certain milestones educationally, socially, medically, it's the child's fault, or it's poor parenting, or it's poverty, or so on. No. Just like the white child that you just gave that diagnosis to, or just like that white child that you just gave that IEP to, because you understand that there are gaps and needs, that also that other ethnically diverse student also needs access to that resource. So again, just these are the changes that need to happen. These are the voices that we are now encouraging to come to the table, because for so long, many of us, the backgrounds that we're from, we've not felt like we've had a seat at the table, that we would be welcome at the table, that we would even be listened to at the table, and anything would be acted on. I do agree. I believe times are changing, and we need to continue to ride that wave and ride that momentum to continue to encourage those in our community to bring their voices to the table, as we're doing here today.
Yeah, so the question was asked, why aren't there culturally sensitive scholarly articles? It's because whenever you look at universities or the educational system, when I look back at history, the IQ test was actually based on a eugenic perspective. It was to prove that there is a hierarchical way of looking at intelligence. It was to promote that the single white abled man was smarter than everybody else. So when we consider why isn't there a cultural lens, it's because it's going through that perspective. And I think, one of the ways that we can solve a lot of these issues is just to be aware. If we can look back at history and then see where it all started and why we are where we are now, it drives more of that change that we're seeking. But we have to understand that even me being South African and seeing, a lot of these systems still in existence, for me, history is just repeating itself. And there's no real impetus for change unless we're aware of what's happening around us. And I think that's the point of today. That's the point of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the point of Me Too movement. It's to showcase their stories. And hopefully people are willing to listen. And if we can get people to listen, then I think it's going to be that impetus we're looking for. But I'm not surprised, but if you say that there's a gap in scholarly articles or in embedding cultural lens within scholarly articles, then maybe now is the time to do it. I don't understand why we want this change and yet things are not changing. And that's where my frustration lies.
Especially when it's not documented, right? Like data drives funding, right? So if data doesn't exist, then how do we get that funding? And Munira, for the Thorncliffe community, what do you think?
No, I'm not surprised at all. And I have to say that very point, it frustrates me every single time I'm in clinic, near into your point that now is the time to do that research. Because for example, with autism assessments, for psychoeducational assessments that we do in the clinic, they're all, the measures have been appropriated, sorry, I'm not sure the right words, the measures were based on a very specific population, a very specific white population. It does not take into account the complexity, the diversity of exposures that kids new to Canada might be experiencing. It does not capture any of that. And so, for example, in some of the measures, just some of the questions that are asked, it puts the parent sitting there in a place of almost shame and embarrassment, that I'm being asked this question. And I can say, as a parent myself, I felt that when I was asked, well, can your son eat with a knife and fork? And I'm like, or a spoon. And I'm like, that's not something we do in our house. We don't really have knife and fork meals. But I was afraid to say that out loud, you know? So why are these things not being captured? And so when we're talking about what we are hopeful diagnostic hubs would do, diagnostic hubs are also hubs of research. So I hope that in the future, and this conversation is a start once again, is that they start looking at it from that perspective, right? All of that research. We really need to go back and do the really deep, messy work of looking at those measures again and including families from all communities and all backgrounds, or else we will continue to be, it'll continue to be an injustice to the children that are coming in.
So to that point, and I'll start with you, Munira, with this one, when we're looking at diagnostic hubs and pathways and families who are going through that, the families that you're working with, what stage of the journey are they in when they come to you? Is it, I'm at the stage of, the school has said something, a friend has said something, should I be worried? Are they coming to you when they have an appointment, or are you seeing them at the diagnosis stage? And so what are parents communicating with you about their journey and what they're going through?
That's a great question. So the families that I'm seeing, they come actually from each of those situations. So some might be coming from there's a referral from the early on because there's a speech delay and the service provider knows there's something else going on. It could be from the school because they're seeing a concern that might look like that the child is on the spectrum. And also we have families referred to us that may have received a diagnosis and they're being referred back to us for service navigation. And what that means, to be honest, that's where I get the most upset, because often that means that families are coming to us, they've been through the diagnostic pathway, and they sometimes have no idea that there was a diagnosis of autism. So they might have been given that diagnosis when their child was 3. They took all of the papers and the sheaf of notes and the diagnostic assessment, they took it home and put it away. They had no idea what it was. And that child is then flagged in school as, Monita, I think this child needs an assessment. There's something going on. And it's only after a lot of questioning that we understand, oh yeah, we did go to the hospital. I'm like, okay, good. And did you see a clinician? Was it 3 visits? Yeah, I think we went to 1. They said there was another appointment, but we didn't go. Or we went to 2, So we know that there's, it's happened, but the communication back to the parent was essentially not there. A communication, a plan, a transition to understand, what does this mean for you, your family, what does it mean for your child? So we see families along all of those pieces, along all of, the full spectrum of that timeline. And along all of those, in all of those specific time points, what we see most is the lack of communication. Whether that's
by diagnostic hubs,
by the diagnostic hubs, yes, around, and whether that is around even coming in, what does this assessment mean? And after the assessment, what does the feedback mean? What does this mean for the family after? Or when you leave here, what are your next steps? So often when we have families come back to us, sometimes it's like everything is happening all over again, where they are experiencing those stages of grief with us, because this is when they're first understanding what that diagnosis actually means. That it's not just a speech delay, and we are not there's no catch-up happening here, so just helping them understand all of that. So it's a lot of, I would say, and I keep on saying this, it's a lot of messy work. It's outside of the box. There's no set formula. It's just basically where we seeing families, we start with where they're at. So whether that's the point of, oh, he's just a late talker like my other kids, it could be at that, or it could be, yes, we did go to the hospital, we don't know what that actually means.
And I'm going to invite the panel to add to this about who you're seeing in terms of families and what they're saying to you about this process.
Our families are pretty much all over the spectrum. Maybe not the autism spectrum, but along the journey. So we do have families who are new to the diagnosis, and we have families who are later and they've got older kids and they're at a different stage. The thing that brings them together, though, is mutuality, understanding the structures and the systems, because that's really the piece that they feel is missing. What we enjoy seeing, I'll say enjoy, because you've got those who for whom the diagnosis, the diagnostic process was so long ago, but yet there are still memories of what could have been done better. They're supporting, encouraging, mentoring the younger families who are going through that journey and helping them to chart a course forward, not unlike our process, our experience, to say to families, here are things that you can do. And here are some steps that may currently exist that didn't exist when we were in our process, but notwithstanding, there are still some barriers you might incur, you might run up against. And here are some things. Here's how to use your voice, because these families have felt so silenced, so judged, that they want somebody to. They want acknowledgement that what they're feeling and experiencing isn't validation. Thank you. They want that, and the group offers that support. And so it's great when you see it, because then it's not just us. They're working together and supporting one another and connecting outside of the meetings themselves to support one another. And that's so encouraging to see.
I think it's SAAAC. I remember when we were in a temple basement around 2010, and at SAAAC, what we saw, me being the behavioral therapist at that time, we saw young kids, we saw older adults, and what was surprising was even with the older adults, they may have been diagnosed, maybe at an early age, but there was no real support for them. There was no clinical support. There was no any family support as well. So a lot of withdrawal from their families, from the communities, all of that. And I think, as much as we talk about diagnosis, it's what happens after. What is the prognosis now? And I think what SAAAC does is that it just creates this social connectedness with people who are like-minded or who have come from similar backgrounds, regardless of race or culture. We're all trying to improve the mental health of not only that person or that loved one, but the entire family. So when we walk into SAAAC, it feels like home, and I think that's the energy that we are striving for, and I think a lot of these organizations are striving for, so that there's a place where people can support each other through this very common thing called mental health that we all go through, at some point of our lives. But it's very important to realize that there are places, there are organizations, there are people who want to make the difference, who want to support you. And it's important to link with these people so that you can feel more invigorated, and there's more hope. And I think if we were to twist things a little bit so that we can adapt to their culture, I think it kind of generates even more hope, because you don't feel like such an outsider. You feel like you belong, and with that belonging, you can go even further.
So it's interesting listening to everybody. And just reading sort of the interviews that your agencies did as well, the challenges that parents faced, the microaggressions that they went through in the process, just something as not getting your name right, or, trying to have small talk with families about things not relevant to them at all. The cottage, yes, that's my favorite example. We were not at the cottage this weekend. So, just what are some specific challenges that you hear from families who go through diagnostic hubs, right? And that, you know, maybe they haven't even clued into it, but you pick it up as an agency? And then how do you support that? And Clovis?
The challenges. I think first and foremost, a number of them don't get the diagnosis as early as other families. This is what we've heard, and this is what the families have said. There's just too many uphill battles. It's pointing to the parents themselves as the problem. Maybe it's behavior. Maybe it's not the diagnosis. It's a veil. It's a microaggression. Basically saying you're not a good parent, and because all Black kids have behavior issues, we see it in the data, right? So it's the fault of the family. So the diagnosis comes late because that's sort of the last on the ladder, as opposed to you got it. Right, so that's one obstacle that we see. Families are also feeling left out of the process, or there is this, nothing happens after they're given that diagnosis. There's this gap, there's this void, there is this quiet. And it's a big rush, a big hit, a big step to get that diagnosis. And even while they're going through the process, there's nobody to handhold them, nobody to explain things to them. Everything is so clinical, it's so rushed, and they don't see people who look like them, so there is no camaraderie. There is nobody to say, hey, do you know that this exists? Do you know about... There's just nothing. And so it's a very serene, it's a very sterile, that's the right word. It's a very sterile environment for them, which for collective cultures, they want people to talk to. They don't understand this us and them, and you have to wait, and when waiting means no service, and no service means your child is not advancing, and there are no supports in the meantime. So families are feeling like if there could be more collectiveness, some more connections, even a referral to a family, a cultural group, or other parent group, just something instead of just this void. So it's the process right now is missing that. It's missing that. If I can just call it the human element. Yes. It's just very clinical, and it's not helpful. And then you layer on the fact that there's just nobody who looks like them in the process. It makes it even, not surprisingly, that, as Munira shared, that they don't come back, because why? I'm just going to feel more out of place. And so I'm out of place enough in society. This is not another place I'm going to feel out of place. And so that's where I think there could be more work done with the hubs. And this is what our families are sharing with us. Less judgment, more people that looks like us, more connection to other families where we can talk, and just give us, don't make the diagnosis the last thing that you think about, but actually think that we're just as likely to have autism as any other group.
Just to add a little bit more to what Clovis is saying, I think what the hubs have got to realize is maybe what they're doing, the way they're working with families pre, during, and post-diagnosis is not wrong, but it may be wrong for us. Maybe okay for them and what they're used to, going again back into the research that unfortunately was faulty research, was really racist and biased research on eugenics and so on. But we have to adjust. Doing these things in these clinical, prescribed, individualistic ways doesn't work for the Black community. I'm not saying when we talk about the Black community, like the South Asian community, like the East Asian community, we're not homogenous. but there are similarities between the different cultures and the different nations. And, speaking on behalf of the Black community, we're communal. We're community. We're a village. I mean, that saying is used and abused around the world. It takes a village to raise a child. Do these hubs really understand what is meant by the term village? That's everybody, mom, dad, auntie, uncle, cousin, neighbor down the street is involved in supporting the raising of that child. That's how these hubs need to get to in dealing with our families. This is where they have failed. These families, this is where they have let us down. So again, it's not to say they got to throw out what they've done, but they've got to understand when this family comes in, it's like an individual education plan. When this family comes in, we got to make an effort to understand what they need. When this family comes in, you cannot use this one brush anymore. So I think that's really it, is let's get a few different brushes and let's really make the effort to bring expertise, like we have in this room right now, to the table to better understand what our Indigenous peoples need, what our Black persons need, Black Canadians, Black North Americans, Caribbean, African, what our South Asian needs from Pakistan, from India, from Sri Lanka, like again, to break it out, our East Asians, again, China, Korea, Vietnam, like again, it's not homogenous. There are similarities, but let's make that effort to find out what these individual cultures need and meet them where they're at versus constantly forcing people to fit into a box that just doesn't fit our needs.
Yes. And that's what Niren was talking about earlier too, the intersectionality of autism, right? It's not homogenous. And from your experiences,
yeah, I was just going to add to like what's all been shared, but I mentioned, SAAAC kind of came into the space with autism because Autism Ontario reached out for us to create a caregiver series on mental health. And so we started doing workshops on what are feelings of shame with autism and having a child with a disability. How are you coping? How do you navigate social circumstances? But what we found in all the workshop series is that parents are coming from very different phases of the journey. Like we had someone join who was like, oh, we just got the diagnosis last week, right? And then we've had someone who's like, I've been navigating this for like over 20 years. But what I see in common with all of them is, kind of echoing the messaging, is everyone feels very isolated and alone. It's very clinical. You get this information, it's thrown on you, you go home and you don't know what to do. You're navigating, different views and perspectives at home, right? Like one parent might be like, okay, I'm for this, the doctor prescribed these therapies, like we need to jump on this, we need to do all of this, while the other parent is like, I don't believe this is true. Like, I think we need to send our child back to India or Pakistan and get another assessment, or maybe it's just the environment or it's the weather. So there's no support for parents and caregivers to, first of all, process and accept the diagnosis before you can run to navigating that journey. You need to educate and support the parents and the caregivers to navigate this. This is a huge change. And it was talked about, the phases of grief. Like we find that parents that are coming to our workshops are still grieving. Like they're still going through denial, or they're angry, or they're trying to work through acceptance. But what's been really nice is that we've been able to build a community. And so we've done 2 rounds of our 5-part series with Autism Ontario. And with the second one, we had the parents create like a WhatsApp group. So they have, if they have questions, they have concerns, they're calling each other, they're not feeling isolated. A lot of people are having challenges with figuring out funding and navigating, what government assistance can we get? So you find that one parent is supporting others. But overall, they've been very isolated and confused as to what is this? What does this mean? Is there hope, right? Like, how is the journey going to unfold? And I think for diagnostic hubs, you really have to take that cultural linguistic approach, right? It's not just, we have a translator. Like we're meeting we'll call a translator. They're going to give you this information. Like, I think you really have to understand the dynamics within the family. What are the religious beliefs? What are their cultural understandings of disability? And what do they do after? they're literally sitting at home with a diagnosis, and they may never go back or follow up until it's picked up again. Or one parent is, fighting that fight while the other parent is kind of like, this doesn't exist, I'm going to ignore this. So many different elements, but that's a few. Yeah.
If it's okay, I just wanted to add in what we're all saying. I understand the whole, like, here's a package from a clinical paradigm on what autism is, what our report says. Here you go, we'll see you later. And I think that, for me, is assimilation. It's basically saying, like, here, based on all my training and all of the terminologies that I have in my mind, I assume you're just going to keep up with me. But just because you speak a different language, just because you come from a different place, other than, here, doesn't make you any less intelligent. But I think when you're giving this report to somebody, you're expecting them to just, understand everything. Mm-hmm. And I think, community liaisons, and we design a program where we're the bridge. So we can have all these clinical reports, but we need to interpret it in a way that's more transferable to somebody who doesn't speak English very well. And what we've done is that we've embedded graphic facilitation within these reports. So now these reports don't look like a whole bunch of words that are mixed together in like some type of soup. It's more articulated in a graphic format, so that these tools and these tips and these strategies can make more sense and more relatable because they're feeding off of a picture. Our program also centers around empowering the parents as much as possible. We're doing our best to embed leadership within the home, both the moms, the dads, the uncles, the aunties, the grandparents, brothers, sisters, so that when we empower them, we all understand what we're doing collectively. We're building a village. We're trying to build a village around that one individual or multiple individuals within that home, so that it's very valuable information. But we just need to adjust it accordingly so that it can be seen through a cultural lens. And I think that's to be creative and to be innovative is what's going to get us through most of this stuff. There's something called the social injustice model, which means that you focus on the issues and you speak about the issues. But the creativity and innovation model says, what are you going to do with all that diversity? Mm-hmm. And when you look at the diversity of ideas and backgrounds and experiences, you have to be inclusive now. You have to look at all these ideas and find one that, wow, that's brilliant. Let's go with that one and try it out, see if it works, and see if that leads to more change. So I think it's again, it's us being aware of these issues on both sides of the coin, and then thinking of a guiding principle that's going to help us get through some of these barriers.
So in sort of the landscape of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, since the murder of George Floyd, like, it's been on the tip of everyone's tongue. Organizations are pledging, diversity here, hire this, representation this. Do you think that's enough for diagnostic hubs in the realm of autism? Or in an ideal world that we can make happen, what do you want to see happen?
I think those terms are, if you look at them separately, they're no good. They have to be interrelated. So you can be diverse but not inclusive. You could be equitable but not inclusive. You could, all of them have to be integrated within, and we have to understand how it all works. If that's enough, I don't think so. I think it's a great starting point, but then I think we have to call for action. We have to embed these practices. So even when we consider, okay, let's hire everybody with diverse backgrounds, that's great. It looks great on paper, but what does that mean in your practices, right? Like, does that exude more opportunity? If it doesn't, then your strategy is all wrong. So we have to measure these changes to ensure that they're effective. If they're not effective, then there's really no point of saying, yeah, we're going to do this so it looks good. Now it's not about image. Now it's about like integrity. It's now the time where we say what we mean and we do what we say.
Move beyond the optics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think no, it's definitely not enough to have that, because as Niran mentioned, it needs to really be integrated into how we're doing our work. And I think part of that is for hubs and providers to really reach out into the communities they serve to see what it looks like from their end and start from there. Start like you mentioned.
Grassroots.
Exactly, grassroots, connecting more with grassroots, seeing what does it look like from their perspective and what should it look like? What does it look like from the grassroots perspective? How does it make them feel? And that's where they need to start building those bridges. We can't just talk about EDI, leave it, as you said, it looks great on paper, but what does it look like? As I said, it's messy work that needs to happen.
And just to echo a lot of the thoughts that have already been said, it needs to not be a box to be ticked, because it's en vogue. We have to do it, but is it actually transforming the people and the people within the staff, but also impacting on how services are done? I think that the challenge, and I think about it as an organization leader myself, working in a mainstream system, how do I get my staff to actually embrace this journey and not make it something, okay, we've got now an EDI plan, we're equity informed, we're moving and we're great, but how have the staff changed? How is their thinking? Is it something that's driven just from above, or are we creating an environment within the organization where that creativity, and I like what Niran had shared about the importance of that creativity, that it can't be one person, the leader or the HR director or the newly appointed director of inclusion, and that's the person driving this, when it doesn't change the entire culture. Systemic racism is embedded in our systems. And if we're not looking at how the systems are perpetuating these things, then it's just a box within that system. Exactly. And so we need to be allowing that creativity to happen, that it's coming from all throughout the agency, throughout the organization. And I will say, even because I'm Black doesn't necessarily mean that I haven't drunk the Western Kool-Aid, right? And so hiring just because a person's Black doesn't mean you automatically have become more equity informed, because is that person also Westernized? And so it's really important that we look at the impact.
Dismantling the oppressor within, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Decolonizing. Oops. Decolonizing your own mind. I've heard that said before, and it's something that I'm constantly working on, in all honesty, because again, being raised here, educated here, that has formed a lot of my views, and that's been, of course, a battle, is fighting those thinkings whilst also trying to find my true authentic self, living in a Western culture. And so as I continue to challenge my thinking, again, as a system leader at a school level, and many of us here at leaders in our own environments, anyone who's in this role in whatever capacity, in this case, in the diagnostic hub capacity, you too have to look at your own mind, your own biases, really acknowledging, owning your own power and privilege. And have you been doing that to do right by your diverse clientele? Or have you been maintaining that status quo What have you been doing to interrupt and disrupt systemically racist and oppressive practices? And how are you role modeling that for the staff that you're working with? These are the questions that we have to ask, that these agencies have to ask as system leaders affecting the lives of so many.
I was just going to add something. I think the biggest thing missing is that you're not including voices of the community. So I think it kind of sums up like everyone's point. Like, you know, you have that person who has a designation to do diversity, equity, inclusion. Are they, first of all, familiar with what's happening within that community? You know, do they have personal experience, professional experience? Do they have a deep understanding? Can they actually be a voice for the concerns that are happening, right? So if you have someone who's, you know, a male talking about female-related issues, I don't know if that's most appropriate, right? So you need to have the right representation. And I think the biggest thing is, like, right now, it's just, in the media, it looks great to have, you know, those positions filled and to have a diverse, you know, range of employees working at your organization. But until you don't really like do it organically, and it's not top down, but bottom up rather, and empowering the community that's there and having, you know, like, especially in the mental health space, like, I'm like, where are our voices, especially in like region of Peel? Why are we not looking at Peel communities? Why are they not informing, you know, for instance, mental health services in that region? Like, what are we doing? Like, why haven't we included those voices? So I think that is the biggest gap. And I don't know, it's maybe we're always in such a rush, like, you know, where like these things become like an afterthought. It's not our priority, right? It's like, oh, we'll get to it. We got to get to it by the end of the strategic, you know, strategic planning, strategic year. Let's just get it in this quarter, hurry up, kind of tick that box. But I think voices of the actual community members is what's missing in a lot of places.
So if you had to give one piece of feedback, so we've looked at sort of the macro levels, the system levels, and systemic change. And then there's the on the ground sort of change that needs to happen, the making that personal connection, learning someone's name, you know, creating an inclusive space. So if you had one piece of feedback that summarizes sort of maybe a micro action as well as a macro action for diagnostic hubs, what would that be for you based on your work?
I think when it comes to systems leaders, the micro aspect is being aware of your own biases. We have to understand what biases are. Biases lead to judgment, and judgment is the opposite of curiosity. If we can be curious as a systems leader and look at what is happening around the world, what has happened historically in our world, how history is repeating itself, there's something called locus of control. I can only control what I can do, what I think, what I say. But I am the only person that can make this change by changing the way that I view the world and the way that I behave and the way that I speak. There's a lot happening, and it becomes very overwhelming. But you can't control it. If you are part of the system, it's been said that that's when you can kind of drive change. If you're a part of it, then that's if you're an outsider, it's becoming more and more challenging. So if you are that role where you are a doctor, you are a police officer, you are a teacher, you are, a director or what have you, those roles mean something in societies and communities. And I think that responsibility and that ownership needs to be recognized, because once you start recognizing what these roles play and how these roles can exude change, I think and I hope that will only inspire people to go to that place where we all want to go, where we all belong, where we all are validated, where we're all heard, we're all seen. And then in terms of me being a parent, this is the type of world that I'm fighting for, so that my son can grow up and he doesn't have to be pulled over by the police because of the color of his skin. And that's where I'm hopefully going, and hopefully I'm going in that direction. But sitting here, I can see there's other people who are also like-minded and want this change. And if I think we all get together We all, focus on something called social impact, where we're not taking these things on by ourselves or like an organization by itself. We're connecting with other organizations. We're connecting with other villages and other tribes. Then I think there's a lot more strength in numbers. And both the micro and the macro are related, but it does start with the micro. And then that'll lead to macro changes.
I think from a macro action perspective, I think the first thing that needs to, and I know we've all talked about this, is diagnostic hubs really need to get into communities. And I think if I think of a dream I have, it's that there is no further need for cultural liaisons, because community and the work of cultural liaisons is so deeply integrated into diagnostic hubs. Those bridges don't need to be there because they're all working together organically, so deeply integrated, right? So that's, again, lots of messy work, but that's where I see that the macro work needs to happen. And on a micro level, just starting today, I would say for diagnostic hubs and providers is when you walk into a room and you're going to be working with the family, then recognize you're not the only expert in the room. That if you are an expert in whatever you've trained in and done a dozen years of school in, the family is the expert in their child. And they come with the expertise of their own lived experience and exposures, and recognize that experience and that expertise as valuable as your own. And with that, like when we talk about in all sorts of care, the buzzword is, team-based care, and we're a team-based practice. Well, you need to include the family in that team on a level playing field. I feel like that's the one action that they could start with.
Because you think diagnostic hubs is done to families rather than
yes,
a collaborative approach.
Exactly. And there's that power differential, right? That really, really needs to be addressed. It's and recognizing that often families, they can come from backgrounds and cultures where you defer to providers in healthcare, you defer to educators. They're the ones that we say yes sir and no sir to, and so we're considered polite because they say sir, but recognizing that that's a part of the culture, and as you mentioned, just like the should we call it the colonial remnants that we have in our cultures, right? So recognizing that when you walk in the room, that this family, like, not generalizing, but recognizing that can play a part in how your interaction happens with them.
I was kind of going to add for micro, like I think it's really important, like where your clinic is based, look around your community. Like, is there someone you can connect with, like a church, a temple, Gurdwara, community center, the families that have come in, is there some way, maybe you've built, the receptionist at the front has built a great relationship with a parent or a caregiver, have a conversation with them outside of your clinic hours, right? Like really get to understand the community. I think building on that human connection, that human element. And I think that takes a lot of, it shouldn't take a lot, but I think it needs to be done off of like your clinic hours, your work hours. I think like micro, in terms of a micro level, that can really change your practice and how you approach, and do like an environmental scan, like a needs assessment environment. Which communities are coming in? Who are you seeing, right? Could it be built into feedback when they're coming in and getting their voice? I think at the micro level, you have everyone working in silos, right? Like people don't even know of all these great community initiatives. How can you connect with organizations in other regions to see what they're doing and how they're doing it, to really network and build each other? Especially being in the nonprofit section, I see like sometimes there are a lot of organizations in competition with each other or not wanting to communicate, so I think really connecting with communities, like in terms of your neighborhood, and then kind of looking at citywide.
Wow, just very amazed by my fellow panelists. And I'm here to all of you. Not really anything to add. I'm just going to basically echo, I think, micro, look in the mirror, begin with yourself. Are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? And if you don't know where to start, Again, connect with your community. Start reading, doing your own professional learning. And that not just comes from the theoretical books, but connecting with the actual people living this experience, with the families and with the community agencies. Seek them out, seek us out. And again, with micro, it starts with the leader. So again, I'm sure we'd all agree, because we're all leaders in our own right in the different work that we're doing. And professionally, as a school leader, I'm the one that sets the tone for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable within my workplace. So whoever the leader is in these hubs, or leaders, and whether it's the clinicians or human resources and so on, they set the tone. So start with yourself. And then again, the macro level, connecting with community. And part of that is your actual clientele that's coming in to that space every day. There's so much expertise in there. Let's not devalue it. Let's not downplay it. Let's seek it out. Let's partner with it. And let's all be better as a result of that collaboration and working partnership.
One of the things that we saw with George Floyd was that it wasn't new, the issue of oppression. And so I think the learning for many of us should be, and what I'm going to say is both micro and macro. It's kind of hard to sort of separate them, but urgency. There are people hurting as a result of the colonial structures, as a result of how we've operated. So that sense of urgency needs to push us to do whatever we need to do to make change. And the other thing I wanted to say is the partnership. And I think Munira said it well in terms of there is no hierarchy. The parent's voice needs to be just as valued. I know in the education system, the parent voice is supposed to play a big role, but we still see there's struggle to get the parent's voice, because parents still at times defer to the system. And what that does with the system, again, all great intended people in the system, but the system makes it so hard for any change to happen because there is no sense of urgency, because the system has to remain intact.
And systems are built by individuals, right?
That's right.
So again, biases,
and it reinforces
looking in the mirror,
itself.
So and then we are then elevated into those positions of power and influence. And then what tone are we setting, right? And how are we valuing expertise? And so just thinking about, I saw all of you gather together and just excitedly talking to each other. What was that excitement about when you got together and you were learning about each other? What was that bonding for you in meeting each other?
I think it's that we're journeying together, because sometimes you feel like you're just this little speck doing your little work and you're not making a difference. And Niren said about social impact. And it's not that we came into this to have social impact per se. We saw a gap, we saw a need, and we were trying to fill it. And then when you see other people, oh, you too? Oh, you? No way. All right, okay, so we've got a movement now.
Yeah.
I think part of that is, again, it's kind of all the same theme, but just how when a parent first receives a diagnosis, the first thing we want to tell them is you're not alone, right? We want to connect them, like as part of my work, one of the first things I do is connect them to a parent WhatsApp group that has parents who have children with autism, to let them know you are not alone, right? So that's something that we started in our neighborhood, but as Clovis, as you said, and many, as you mentioned, that need for human, the human element, that sense of connection. So to feel like, we're not alone in this, and not alone as individuals, not alone as neighborhoods or communities, but rather all of our communities and all of their beautiful cultures and backgrounds and experiences. We're all not only dealing with, but celebrating a lot of our not only our, how do I say this? Not only our while we face the challenges that we face, we also celebrate the beauty within the people that we serve, within the communities that we belong to, right? And that is, I think, our common goal as well. Like, help others see the beauty in our culture, not just the challenges of like, oh, poor them, like in Thorncliffe, there's lots in the news all the time, poor us, but really understanding what is beautiful about our communities, right? So I think that's what made me excited today.
I think the excitement was we can make our tribe bigger, and I think we always refer to the I a lot, but I think if we connect with other tribes, the language shifts to we, and I think when we can say we, it's quite powerful, because here I am thinking, okay, I'm doing this, I'm going ahead. But it can be very scary, when you're a parent and you're trying to, create this group so that other parents don't feel like this. And I think when that happens, it kind of feels you're isolated. But then when you meet other people who want to help other parents, or you can learn from other people and understand, that you're on the right track. And if there was ever an issue that, you just kind of run into this roadblock, you can look over to your right or your left, and people are there to kind of help you. COVID has changed the game. And we as organizations, not-for-profits, unfortunately, a lot of not-for-profits shut down because of COVID. But I wish that we could all, at that point, even get together and say, how do we keep on going? Because this is an element that we never expected. Actually, that's not true. We fully expected another pandemic to always, but we have to look at all of the risks before we launch something, so that we can learn from other people's mistakes, we can grow, we can be very resilient, and we can only do that if we're together. And I think that was the excitement, that we're on the right track. And if we're working together, I think there's going to be even greater impact.
I just think it's so exciting that a lot of times you see communities and, people talk about like we're struggling, but it's like we're struggling and we're doing something about it, right? Especially navigating a foreign playing field, like there's the systems here not knowing how to do things, and we're like, we're just going to get something off the ground and we're going to help people and we're going to figure it out as we go. We don't have someone teaching us the way, like how to set up these initiatives, how to have these conversations, how to bring our community together. And I'm most proud of community members that show up. Like I've had parents that are like, I've been watching your Zoom links in my email, and on the third attempt, they actually signed in. They're like, the last 2 times I was like, I don't know, do I want to show up? What's going to happen? So I think it's just amazing. And I think it's so exciting to hear like a lot of the overlap in work and the initiatives that are going out to community members and family members, and that we're building that village despite all the challenges. And part of it, it's like, this should just be there. Like, why isn't it there, right? We're talking about the Western society, the Western medical system, like it's kind of set up against how our cultures operate. So part of it is unfair because it's like we have to do all this extra work to get the help. But at the same time, I'm like, it's just amazing that, people are doing the good work. They're seeing their lives and their experiences, and they're like, how can I change the narrative for the person after me? So I think that's just, it's really exciting, and it motivates. Like I know for myself, it just motivates me to keep going. So I really appreciate everyone here and just the conversation.
I had goosebumps. That was powerful. Thank you, everyone, so much. Literally with all the families on this panel, I could have stayed all day and listened. You bring such knowledge and expertise and passion and advocacy. And hopefully, this is the beginning of seeing more of a collective approach to diagnostic hubs. So I thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yes, our pleasure. Thank you.